Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And this is part two of a two-part video in which I discuss Ives's life and then the Fourth Symphony in particular. In the previous video, I talked about the premiere of the second movement and the first movement in 1927 and the premiere publication of the second movement in 1929 and Bernard Herrmann's radio premiere of the third movement fugue in 1933, and some other things about the history of the work. But I left it at that. In this video, I want to pick up after Ives's death in 1954. At that point, the Fourth Symphony was in disarray. Now, there is this legend of the fourth movement being lost and then being discovered in a drawer somewhere, and that just is not true. The fourth movement was intact in the two sketches that exist all along, and it had never been lost. But again, the problem was that all we had was the cowl engraving and then the parts to this partial premiere in 1927 of just the first two movements that were played by 50 members of the New York Philharmonic under Eugene Goossens and this sort of ad hoc concert at Town Hall. And that wasn't what we needed to be able to premiere the entire thing. Now, composer Elliott Carter, who had known Ives since his student years, was very interested in arranging a European premiere of the Fourth Symphony with Hans Rosbaud at the helm. And word of that spread, and the Americans did not like it. They're like, no, we can't have this, fantastic looking work be premiered in Europe. It has to be premiered on American soil. So the American Symphony Orchestra was created to premiere the Ives Fourth with Leopold Stokowski to be on the podium with as many assistant conductors as would be needed. And librarians at the Free Library in Philadelphia labored for quite some time putting together a hand-copied score using what they could salvage from the cowl engraving of the second movement. The problem with the cowl engraving, it was engraved by Hermann Langinger, as we discussed before, but it's this cowl publication, New Music, is that you've got multimetrics everywhere. You got 3/4 for 4 bars against 4/4 for 3 bars. So the beats line up, but bar lines are in different locations and things like that. That had to be ironed out, and then just all the parts that would be necessary to play the entire piece needed to be created. So after the librarians in Philadelphia were finished with their work, the premiere was given on April 26th, 1965 by Stokowski and two conductors, Jose Cerebrier and David Katz. And then it was filmed. And the film gives the impression that you're watching the premiere. Well, actually, if you look carefully at it, you can tell, no, they've filmed this separately, likely in the days that followed the actual premiere. But it's a documentary, and the first half hour of it gives the history of the piece, and it's quite an interesting thing to behold. I have a link to it on my Ives Fourth Symphony site. It's right there on YouTube for anyone to watch. And it's an interesting and fantastic historical document. Well, there was, great interest in performing the work after that premiere, and it was being done fairly widely. And unfortunately, there's no official count of who did it and where and how many times it's been done. But safely, it's been done hundreds of times. But to the annoyance of so many players who were having to read largely illegible parts that contained no cues. And then there was the problem with the score itself, which was a mess. And in the publication that followed the premiere in 1965, Schirmer A&P put out a reproduction of the very score that Stokowski had used. There's a preface by John Kirkpatrick that gives the history of the piece, and then there's a reproduction of Ives's conductor's note. And then there's nothing else except for this really sloppy hand copy with bits of the cowl engraving. And that's all anyone had to go on. So there were conductors who wanted to program the work, but they didn't because of the state of the materials. And there were others who were not daunted by the state of the materials and said, we're just going to do it anyway and make the best of it. So in the 70s, William Brooks, an Ives scholar, did a doctoral dissertation called Sources and Errata List, Charles Ives' Fourth Symphony Movement 2. And in it, he went through the cowl engraving and compared it against the manuscripts and listed every place where there was an error and where things needed to be fixed. And everyone was very excited by this thesis because it was a detailed scholarly attempt to go through and make sense of that manuscript. And so Brooks was actually tapped to do an entire edition of the Fourth Symphony. And an opportunity arose in the late 80s for conductor Michael Tilson Thomas to premiere the entire Fourth Symphony. And at that point, Brooks's work was far from finished. So they said, well, let's use the first movement that he's edited, and then Jim Sinclair worked on the second movement, Kenneth Singleton worked on the third movement, and Wayne Shirley worked on the fourth movement. And so they put together a provisional critical edition of the Fourth Symphony that was then recorded by Michael Tilson Thomas with the Chicago Symphony in 1987. And that was released as the first recording of the critical edition. Well, it was actually the first recording of sort of a provisional critical edition, with everything still sort of copied out by hand and not really in an ideal state at all. Well, where do I fit into this? I discovered Ives at age 15 in 1983 in the stacks of the library, the main library of the University of the South at Sewanee, Tennessee. I was attending a secondary school down the road from it, St. Andrew's Sewanee School, and I was at that school for 2 years, the 1983, 84, and 84, 85 year, my 11th and 12th grade years. And I had previously attended the Sewanee Summer Music Center in the summer of 83, and played in an orchestra for the first time, and was very excited by classical music because of that experience. And it was in the fall of 83, when I was 15, that I saw the 1965 score on a shelf, and I pulled it off, wondering to myself, well, what kind of music would be written by a composer named Ives? It just seemed like such a strange name for a composer. And then I looked inside and I saw all these subdivisions, the second measure of the first page. The trumpet player has to take a 6/4 bar and subdivide it into 2 quartuplets and then play internal triplets within the quartuplets. I'm like, how do you do that? What kind of mental acrobatics do you have to go through to be able to produce that rhythm? And I looked through the score and I saw it was just loaded with all these subdivisions. And that was the thing that was intriguing me the most initially. And I listened to the Ozawa recording, which they had there at the library, and tried to follow along with the score, and I couldn't. I got lost. But the music, it just baffled me, but intrigued me at the same time. And I went back to my dorm at the school where I was enrolled and went to my best friend and I said, I've just listened to this crazy piece, and it has like all these tunes, like the Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, being blasted out by the trombones, and there's all this dissonant banging in the pianos and the strings. And my friend said, Tom, I think you liked that piece. I said, well, maybe you're right. Maybe I should go back and give it another shot. And so I did, and once again, I couldn't follow the score, but I thought I have to get to know this piece better. So I checked the score out, and then obtained the Stokowski recording and began listening to the recording all the time and follow along with the score. And bit by bit, I was memorizing the score. I didn't realize it, but that's what was happening. It was sort of imprinting on me at this very early age when things stick, right? You learn foreign languages when you're young and they stick with you for the rest of your life, right? And Ives is a foreign language in its own way, right? So off to Oberlin I go, and at age 17, I was a year ahead of myself in school. I'd skipped 4th grade. And the fall of my sophomore year, the 1986-87 year, the Cleveland Orchestra performed the Fourth Symphony under Dochnany. And I was just amazed that I was going to get to hear this piece live. I had been just so swept up by it the 2 years before in high school. And there in college, I had this opportunity to hear the thing. And I went to the concert, and I just could barely move. I was just blown away, most especially by that second movement. And that cemented it for me. I'm like, okay, I've got to get deeper into this piece because it's just so extraordinary. And I went and looked at the microfiche of the Cowell edition, because all I'd ever known was the 65 score, and I never knew what was behind all the hand copying on the second movement that was covering up something. And then when I saw that it was covering up all these multimetrics, I was even more blown away. I'm like, okay, this is really the most fascinating piece that I've ever encountered. And I started reading every doctoral dissertation I get my hands on, regarding Ives and the Fourth Symphony. And then, the Celestial Railroad kept coming up in relationship to it. And that's when I went to Yale to look at the manuscript of the Celestial Railroad and the Fourth Symphony and other Ives works. And I saw that there's this, this eerie correspondence between the Celestial Railroad piano piece and the first scoring of the second movement of the Fourth Symphony. So here is American Music, Volume 12, Number 4, Winter 1994, with a reproduction of an Ives manuscript from the Celestial Railroad on the cover. And it's in this volume that my work was finally published, that I'd begun working on during my final years at Oberlin. And in it, I established this relationship between the two pieces, and how, if you see how the Celestial Railroad is constructed, it unlocks how he used it as sort of a compositional workshop for drafting the initial ideas of its scoring as the comedy movement in the Fourth Symphony. And so briefly now, I'm going to show you with manuscripts how it actually works. So here we're looking at the very manuscript page of the Celestial Railroad that's on the cover of American Music that I showed you. And there's actually a lot going on this page. Obviously, there's a lot of notation, but notice that it's a mixture of ink and pencil. And if you look at the second system, there are far more notes than one player could possibly execute. And this was the cause of so much confusion for so many years. Like, no one could figure out, how many players the Celestial Railroad actually required for performance. And this is part of the reason that it had been put into print. John Kirkpatrick sensed that there was something that wasn't right with every edition that had been presented to him. Now, at the bottom, there's a section from the engraving of the Concord Sonata from 1921 printing that I have distributed freely. And notice that there's a straight pen over on the far right. It's not the only patch that's on this page. The top system has two layers, two strips of notation on top of a base layer. We're going to be peeling those back and looking at them in detail. The third system is constructed very much the same way, with patches covering a base layer of notation on the staff paper itself. But there's no notation beneath the Concord patch at the bottom. And in fact, throughout the entire manuscript, wherever there's a patch taken from the Concord engraving, there's no notation beneath it. It's just cut out and just put in place directly on the staff paper, which shows that it's part of the original construction of the entire manuscript. And this is the first thing that allows you to date the Celestial Railroad as being from 1921, because Ives didn't receive the printing of the Concord Sonata until January of that year. So he could not have constructed this manuscript any earlier than that. So having established that, let's take a look at what's going on in this top system. If you remove all the layers, you're going to see the germinal idea that Ives began with for the passage. And here it is. If you remove the straight pens and take away the staff paper strips, then you see the original thing that came to mind for him. This is the initial working out of the Camptown Races passage. Notice that it starts at the very end of the top two staves, and then there's an arrow that's drawn down to the fourth and fifth staves where the material continues. And here's what it looks like if you engrave the thing, which is far easier to process. And then finally, here's what it sounds like. Next, he rewrote the passage two different ways. And so he did this on a single strip of staff paper, which he pinned in place on that manuscript. And there is an arrow curved over here in the left margin with the word "or" beside it. So it's showing that either the first version or the second version might be used, perhaps. But what do they actually sound like? Well, first let's look at a diplomatic engraving of each one. Here's an engraving of the first one, and this is what it sounds like. And here's a diplomatic engraving of the second one, and here's what it sounds like. Finally, here's the top layer, which is the last version of the material that he created for the piano piece. And if you engrave it out, this is what it looks like. And let's listen to what it sounds like. Well, what does this have to do with the comedy? Well, there are three manuscript sources to the movement. There is a score sketch in Ives' hand, which is an initial working out of the ideas of the movement. And then there's a fair copy by Ives, where he's sort of settling in on what the movement is and how it should be scored, and it's been amended by him. And then there is a copyist copy by one of his copyists named Reis, R-E-I-S, with emendations by Ives. And then there's the Langinger engraving that was published in Cowell's New Music, that I've often called the Cowell engraving in this video. Now, going back to the Slush Railroad, Camptown Races passage, we have these layers where what's on the staff paper at the very bottom is this germinal idea, and then each successive patch, each layer, is more complex than the one that's below it. And what's on top is a form that is pretty much like what we know in the Fourth Symphony, isn't it? Well, what do we have in the Fourth Symphony? As I said, we have these three sources followed by the Langinger engraving. And the first source is the score sketch, which is the earliest working out of the materials. And the form of the materials found in the score sketch matches the form of the materials in the Slush Railroad on its top layers in every case, with pencilings in the Slush Railroad manuscript matching instrumental lines in the score sketch. Also, there are several sections in the comedy movement that are not present in the score sketch. They were added in the fair copy, which is the second manuscript towards the finished movement. And those passages that are missing in the score sketch are also missing in the Celestial Railroad. That the two works match each other in terms of the musical passages that have been created and the order in which they are presented. And if you compare them, it's so obvious that he wrote out the piano piece first and then thought, well, you know what, I could expand this for orchestra. And then he put in these pencil jottings as to, well, we could add a violin line here or a trombone line there. And then if you look at a score sketch, well, those little pencil markings that could not be played by one pianist in the Slush Railroad become these instrumental lines, and in the form that you find them in the score sketch. So it becomes just elementary that the Celestial Railroad was the thing that he wrote first, and then he decided, oh, I'll expand this and turn it into a symphonic movement. And thus, this means that the comedy movement of the Fourth Symphony was a work of the 1920s. It wasn't written in the early teens, as I've sort of implied in his writings, although he never said so. But this also means that the comedy movement is a tone poem on the Celestial Railroad by Hawthorne, because the piano piece is obviously that, and it has the names of various characters labeled right there. Mr. Smooth It Away is identified very clearly, and so on. But so now let's look at the score sketch of the corresponding passage that we've been looking at in the Celestial Railroad manuscript. So here is the correlative passage in the score sketch, the first of the three manuscript scorings of the comedy movement. And here's that piano line we've been looking at, this fantasy on Camptown Races. And it goes across 2 different pages in the manuscript, and that if you engrave it out, this is what it looks like. And it's pretty darn close to the version that it eventually became. So what does it sound like? Well, it sounds like this. Now, finally, here's what it looked like in the Langinger engraving. And there it is, all scored out. And just as a reminder, here's what it sounds like. I reached out to the Ives people, to Wiley Hitchcock and Jim Sinclair and Peter Burkholder, and said, I've made these conclusions about the Fourth Symphony and its development, and I want to run them past you. And they looked at my paper and were very excited. And they said, okay, wait a minute, you've gone deep into the Fourth Symphony, Second Movement, and figured out that our chronology is wrong. We didn't understand that the Celestial Railroad was central to the development of the Second Movement. One of them said, "You've destroyed our edition." I said, "Well, I didn't mean to destroy anything, but this is what I figured out." So they then commissioned me to edit the Celestial Railroad for its premiere publication. Prior to my work on the Celestial Railroad, no one could figure out how many players were needed for it, because the manuscript has this mixture of ink and pencil, and there are more notes than one player could possibly reach. Well, once you understand that what's going on there is the ink stuff is for the piano, and the pencil is just a set of orchestration jottings that he had in mind for how to expand the music into a full orchestral work by adding additional lines. So you would think, well, let's put up the line here of, Turkey in the Straw, and this is going to go into the strings. Well, you can't play the Turkey in the Straw line, but you're not meant to. And unless you understand that what's going on in that manuscript is this mixture of a piano piece and memos towards an orchestral expansion of it, only then can you decode it and then make a proper edition of the piano piece itself. And so, and there was a copyist copy by Price, one of his copyists that he talked about quite a bit, that was at the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center. It had been given there by the widow of composer John Becker, who had received the Price copy as a gift from Ives. Becker never returned it, and so it ended up with his own papers, and it ended up there in Lincoln Center. So it's this important work in the history of the Fourth Symphony that's not at Yale. At any rate, you have to sort of compare the two manuscripts to be able to derive what the best text is of the piece. At any rate, I created an edition of the Celestial Railroad based upon my analysis of the work, and its relationship to the Fourth Symphony, and then its relationship as it exists in the two manuscripts. And I copied the whole thing out by hand, and wanted to get a music notation program to set the thing, and I was going to get Finale, because that was what everyone was using at the time. This is the very, very early 1990s. And then Jim Sinclair said, "Oh, no, don't get Finale. Get the score program. It's what all the classical publishers use. That's their preferred program." I'm like, what is that? It's the score program. So I contacted Schirmer and I said, what is the score program thing? And they said, oh, well, you have to contact Leland Smith, who's a composition instructor at Stanford on the West Coast. It's his program, but yeah, we use it for everything. So here's his contact info. So I wrote to him and I found out, how to get score. And so I got it and set the Celestial Railroad with it. And then I sent that to Sinclair, and he said, "Oh, you have a career as a music engraver. You just don't realize it. Send this out to all the New York publishers and they'll love you. They'll send you work." I'm like, really? Okay. And so I did. And that's exactly what happened. Suddenly I have all this work coming in from publishers on the East Coast wanting my services with the score program. Now, what exactly is the score program? Let's take a look. This is a page of music displayed by the score program. Score was created by Leland Smith, who was a Stanford music composition instructor. He taught there from the very late 50s until the early 90s. And he took an interest in computers in the 1960s, and he was just in the right place in the right time. And he began writing this program first on mainframes, and then he eventually ported it to DOS in the mid-'80s. And when it was released in the mid-'80s, in '85, it was the very first commercial music topography system. It predates Finale by 1 year. And it became the preferred program of publishers across the world because it offered such incredible precision. And to this day, in fact, there are a few programs that equal it, and there's some projects that still can only be done in Score. Now, looking at this display, you might think, well, this isn't really anything, is it? It looks kind of primitive, doesn't it? Well, here it is as it prints, as displayed in a PDF. As you can see, it's absolutely lovely. The slurs look very natural. All the graphics fill out in just this very fine way. And all the text is exactly the same length as you had seen it in the score file, because what Score does is it measures the width of every text character and then applies it to that primitive font that it uses for displaying text. So you're actually getting the exact location of every character and every text string. So you never have to worry about things crashing into each other in the print that were not there on screen when you were setting them. And this goes with all the graphics. Everything is composed of incredibly small vector graphics, tiny little line segments. And from a distance, you cannot tell. You have to get very, very close before you begin to see that a music font is not being used, that it's really just a collection of straight line segments. And even at this level, you can't tell it. So let's go back and look at Score again and talk about it more. So here we are looking at that bassoon page in the Score program again. We talked about how good the graphics are and how there's actually this incredible fidelity between the primitive graphic display that you're seeing here in the Score screen and what actually gets printed. I mean, everything's exactly where it's located, between the two. But the real genius of the program is that it's encoded with strings of numbers that make sense once you get into the way that Score is handling them. I've just selected the slur right here, and I'm now increasing the curvature and I'm decreasing it. As I'm doing that, look up at the top of the screen. One of those numbers is changing. It's going way up, and then it's going way down. I'm using the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard to do this. Well, what's going on here? So here we're looking at a Score file that just has a note and a staff in it. And that's just for simplicity in explaining how this thing works. Notice as I move the note around, and I'm using the arrow keys on my computer keyboard to move it left and right, that the third number up there is shifting, right? Well, that number is called a parameter. It's called specifically parameter 3. There are up to 19 parameters per item. The first line up there says par number 1, 11, 2, 12, 3, 13, and so on. It just means that the line below it is parameters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And if there were another line of information, it would be parameters 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. But it's parameter 3 that tells you where the thing is located left to right. And there are 200 units from the extreme left to the extreme right where you can locate things. So if I say set parameter 3 to position 180, well, it's now at position 180. And I say set it to position 20, now it's at 20. And you can be very precise with this. You could say set it to position 53.2536, and that's where it's gone. Now the display just shows 53.25, but that 36 that I typed out is actually encoded, and it's actually affecting where it's actually located. Up and down vertically, Parameter 4 is controlling that. If you wanted to add accidentals to it, you use P5, and so on. So every component of the graphic, where it's located and what kind of attributes it has and what kind of graphics are attached to it and so on, is all defined by these numbers. And at first, the numbers may seem kind of intimidating, but it's not that hard. You start working with it, and the numbers start making sense because they're very consistent from one kind of graphic to the next. But it allows you this incredible precision as to where things are located. And so this is why SCORE was the preferred program of classical publishers for decades, in fact. And there still are projects, as I said, that you can only do in SCORE. It doesn't have a global editor that's watching you as you're working and making decisions about you and deciding what's better to do and overriding your decisions. You never have to worry about that. Everything is being done basically directly by you and with great precision. It does have some high order functions that you can apply, but they're a bit limited, and that's where I got involved in the evolution of SCORE. So I engraved the Celestial Railroad using the SCORE program, and I sent the engraving out to various music publishers, and then they began sending me work, and it was everything from choral octavos and high school band scores to complicated orchestral music by Elliott Carter and John Adams. So it was really the gamut. And through it all, I worked out step-by-step procedures for solving notational problems, like how to position beams so that you could read them most easily and things like that. And I realized, well, these procedures could be automated. If I could just work out computer programming, I could probably solve this. So I did. I began writing computer programs that would crack open the output files of SCORE, read in those number strings, read in that data, analyze it, manipulate it, change it, and then write all the data back out to disk. So you could then open those files in SCORE and have all that work automated for you. Now, I wasn't writing plugins because there's no such thing as a plugin to the SCORE program. It just doesn't work that way. It's a standalone DOS program. I was writing standalone programs myself. These were 32-bit executables that read in SCORE data and manipulated it and wrote it out again. And I wrote a program for editing beams and one for arranging accidentals, and even a conditional editor that had an original programming language that was specific to the SCORE program. And people who used the SCORE program were buying my programs. And at one point, they were being used on every continent except for Antarctica. It's kind of bizarre for me to think about this even today. But the biggest nut to crack of all was horizontal spacing. So here we have a condensation of a passage in the Ives Fourth and the second movement in which you have multimetrics. And by that, I mean that there are different meters on each staff, but there's a common beat unit among all the staves. So the top staff here has a metrical pattern that goes 7/16, 3/16, 5/16, and then it starts a 7/16 measure that's going to continue on the next system down, which is not shown here. The next two staves have a 5/16 meter followed by three 3/16 meters, followed by the beginning of a 4/16 meter. And that measure, of course, would continue on to the next system. And then the bottom staff is just a 4/4 meter and a complete measure of 4/4. So everything on this system adds up to a whole note in total duration. And that should be fine, but what happens when you try to space it? Boom! This is what happens. You can input the thing in SCORE, but if you apply its spacing routine to the page, it freaks out. And the staves disappear, and the notes get thrown asunder, and it's just a nightmare. And the problem is it doesn't know what to do with the dueling bar lines. It doesn't know how to handle situations in which the beats add up, but the bar lines are in different locations. So this is something that was a huge problem for setting the Ives Fourth with the SCORE program. And except for this, the SCORE program was ideal for setting the Ives Fourth. I called Leland Smith, the author of the score program, and asked him, like, how do I solve this? And he threw a series of Band-Aid solutions to me, and I was able to point out to him in each case why it just wouldn't work. And then he eventually said, well, why don't you write your own program? I thought, good grief, how am I supposed to do that? And I've been writing all these algorithms for so many years at that point that, algorithmic thinking was very much part of my daily life. And so I spent the summer of '99, basically not sleeping, trying to figure out how to do this, how to reproduce what was so good about Leland's spacing routine, and then overcome its shortcomings. And there were other shortcomings than the one that I've just shown you, but the one I just showed you was the biggie. I had to solve that, foremost. And eventually, the insomnia ended when I figured out how to do it. And then it took months to write a beta version of the program, and then I began sending it out to score users to test out for me, and then it worked out, and I began selling it and refined it over time with the work that I continue to do, and with the reports I got from people. The way that software development works is you send something out and you think you've got it pretty much working, and then these weird cases start appearing, and then you have to figure out, well, how do I accommodate that? And so I was able to fine tune it. All right, next, let's actually look at the spacing routine that I've described. Here is the very same system we looked at earlier with the multimetrics and the dueling bar lines. And I've enlarged the staff size of it to make it easier to read. But what we're going to do is use Score's built-in spacing routine, not to space the entire system as we did before, but rather just to space each staff individually. And that it can do, but with some problems, which we'll go into. First, just to show you that the entire system is not aligned correctly, look at the first beat on each staff. The G down here is not aligned with the B flat up here, and the B flat up here is not aligned with the B on the staff above it, and that B isn't aligned with the G on the first staff, and so on. So just starting with the very first beat, like nothing is aligned from staff to staff. And if you look along the staves and you count the beats and you see where things should be, you'll discover they don't actually align. Even here in the middle two systems, which have the very symmetrical pattern, a 5/16 bar followed by 3/16 bars, the 3/16 meters are in different locations between the two staves, and the bar lines are not aligned at the beginning, or nor here nor there, and then when you get to the 4/16 meter change, they're not aligned. And then look up here on the top staff, this G sharp is running into the 7/16 meter that precedes it. So even when Score is trying to space out this staff by itself, it gets confused. So there are some serious problems with Score's spacing routine, and they needed solving. So how do you space this system? Well, you don't do it within Score. As we saw earlier, if you do, then all the notes fly off the screen. What you do is you save your work, you exit Score, and you go to DOS, and then you run my program, which is actually not a DOS program. It's a 32-bit executable called LJ for Line Up and Justify, which is the name of the routine, the correlative routine in Score. And boom, it's done. I just fed it that file that we're working on, and lickety-split, it did its work. So let's open up to see what it did. Open up Score, and boom, it spaced everything appropriately. Look, the very first beat on each staff is exactly in the same location. It's where it should be. And then look at the position of the bar lines and the meters of the middle two staves. They're aligned perfectly. And if you were to go through this and count up the beats and see where everything should go, everything, in fact, is where it should be. And it even took care of this problem with the G sharp that had been running into the 7/16 meter that came before. So my routine is not just handling the location of the bar lines, it's actually handling the location of all the graphics. And this routine is not specific to the Ives Fourth, it's specific to all music. And so I had Score users across the globe who acquiring my program for their own work because it helped them in so many complicated projects, as it did for me. And again, it took about a year to work out this program and get it to work the way that it needed to, so that it could handle, the Ives Fourth Symphony, and really in the process, just all symphonies, all music. And I continued to write other programs that were all intended to solve problems I was facing in all the work I was doing. And I was being hit by weird notational situations in so many pieces coming from so many different directions, and they were all piece by piece confronting me with the things that I needed to solve to be able to really do the most robust engraving of the Ives Fourth Symphony possible. And this went on for, 10 years, from when I got the program in 93 until 2003, when all the copyrights got cleared, and finally my work could begin in earnest. Before going any further, we need to take a detour back to the 1980s, when Gunther Schuller, who had a long history of conducting the Ives Fourth, was lobbying for there to be an all-in-one critical edition that would present Ives's original notation and then performance-friendly renotations, not side-by-side, but sort of stacked, one staff on top of another, which would have required incredibly tall pages or incredibly small staff sizes. I mean, either way, it was really untenable. And Jim Sinclair saw this and realized this would not work, and so he lobbied successfully, thank goodness, for there to be two scores. First, a critical edition that would present Ives's notation as he originally had written it, and then a corresponding performance score. So in 2003, after I'd finished writing all the programs that were necessary to be able to set both versions of the score with photocopies of all the manuscripts at my side for reference, for checking everything and making sure everything was right, and the score program in front of me, I began working on those editions that had been prepared back in the 80s for Michael Tilson Thomas's performance with Chicago and that recording. And those editors again were Bill Brooks, Jim Sinclair, Kenneth Singleton, and Wayne Shirley. And so with Jim Sinclair working as volume editor over the whole thing and me working as his assistant, we began working together on the critical edition. So I started with the fourth movement because it had the greatest vertical challenge, going up to 50 some odd staves per page. I had to work out, how to accommodate that and what kind of page size ratio we needed and that kind of thing. And then I moved from there to the second movement, and then the first movement, and then finally the third movement. So I started with the most difficult movement, and then I worked my way backwards to the easiest one. And so here we see 2 pages from the critical edition, second movement, with those wonderful multi-metrics, all the different misaligned bar lines. This is the way that Ives wrote the music out, and it's important to be able to see how he was conceptualizing it. And after this was finished, then I was assigned the task of the performance score, and that involved reworking every single page of the critical edition and coming up with optimal renotations that would allow a preservation of Ives's intentions for the music, and in opening up and an exposing of all of them, and then at the same time allowing for the easiest possible execution of them. And so again, this was just like a double joy to be doing the score basically twice. And this also took many months to complete. Because of scheduling issues and some other things, it wasn't until 2009 before I could work on the parts to the edition. And this turned out to be a boon, because in 2003, I was prepared to handle both versions of the score, but I really wasn't prepared to handle what was needed in the parts. In part, this is because the score program itself doesn't give you many controls for extracting parts from a score. You have to do most of the work yourself. And I had devised all manner of routines for handling that. And those routines needed to be refined, and they were during those years between 2003 and 2009. But there was one project that landed on my desk in particular that really helped the Ives Fourth edition quite a bit, and that was a new edition of The Wooden Prince by Bela Bartok that had been prepared by his son Peter. And that piece has string division that actually rivals what's found in the Ives Fourth. So here's a page from that Wooden Prince score, and we're going to look at the strings And the top three staves here are violin 1. The top staff is desks 1 through 4. The middle staff is desk 5 and 6. And the bottom staff of the 3 is desk 7 and 8. Okay, fine. The next 3 staves are violin 2. And it's the same distribution, 1 through 4, and then 5 and 6, and then 7 and 8. And the same kind of thing happens with the other strings on this page. But is it the same from page to page? No, it's not. It changes from page to page. Here's violin 2, and the top staff is not desks 1 through 4, it's desks 1 and 2 alone. Desks 3 and 4 are the middle staff, and desks 6, 7, and 8 are the bottom staff. But wait, where is desk 5? It's here. It comes in on the second beat, joining desks 1 and 2. And if you go down the page and look at the other distributions, you'll see that it's completely different from page to page. And the amount of complicated divisi that is changing constantly in the piece is incredible. And it became apparent that it would be impossible to create all-in-one parts for this scoring. So you couldn't create a unified violin 1 part and a unified violin 2 part and so on. If you tried to do that, you'd end up with so much music crammed on each page with multiple staves showing the different divisi and with arrows pointing at which desk is to join in with a different desk at a certain point and that kind of thing, that page turns wouldn't be possible, and it would just be just a hideous mess for the players. So the only solution that I could see was to extract the parts by desk and to create dedicated desk parts. So violin 1, desk 1 would be a part, violin 1, desk 2 would be a part, and so on down all the desks of the violin 1 section, and so on throughout the entire string section. So this came to over 1,000 pages of parts. In order to pull it off, I had to write special programs to facilitate, the engraving of the score and then the extraction of the parts and the cleaning them up and all that. So that then became the basis for the work that I had to do extracting parts from the Ives. I had already engraved all the divisi and the fourth movement of the Ives Fourth, but I hadn't really solved how to, pull out all the parts and how to present them in the least ambiguous way to all the players. And it was through working on this project and being confronted with this kind of complicated divisi that I was forced with a problem that was correlative, and I was forced to come up with a programmatic solution that would work for it and all scores like it. Returning to the Ives Fourth parts, I finished the first proof of them in the fall of '09. And this created this interesting condition in which we had a complete set of parts, unproofed, that could be read through by an orchestra for us to determine whether or not they were actually working. And the stars aligned, and on April 26th, 2010, which was the 45th anniversary to the very day of the Stokowski 1965 premiere of the Ives Fourth. How did this happen? The New England Conservatory arranged for a student orchestra to read through the parts with Jim Sinclair and Gunther Schuller to preside at the podium. And this was an ad hoc orchestra of students who, had been asked to sign up for this if they could, and those who had time in their schedule did. But we didn't have a complete string section, for example, but we still had players for all the major parts. And so this was going to give us some sense of whether or not, the parts would actually be working. Gunther and Jim shared time on the podium, and the musicians just played the piece. They didn't fall apart. They didn't get lost. It was all working. The parts and the score were working just fine. So this gave us the confidence to know that, the work we had done was going to pay off. And so in December of 2011, the critical edition was put into full print, but not the performance score. It was only a rental item at that point, and it was to remain a rental item for, as it turned out, the next 9 years. And at first, this was very frustrating to me because I wanted to see it in print along with the critical edition, of course. But then it had created this golden opportunity for me to be able to make incremental edits to it, the score, and then to all the parts. And so I seized on the opportunity to chase around rehearsals and performances of it. And this turned into this 5-year project between 2012, when it was premiered in Lucerne, Switzerland, through November of 2017, when Michael Tilson Thomas did it with the San Francisco Symphony. And again, this was a delay that allowed for refinement and a far better product that could have been possible. So it ceased being a rental item and became a fully published score in March of 2020, just as the pandemic was getting started. At every stage of this project, there was a delay that allowed for quality. And like when I first learned the score program, there was some enthusiasm about me working on the Fourth Symphony even then, back in 1993, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed to put in the time to learn the craft of engraving and also to write all those programs that were needed to be able to set the scores. And then when I was working on the scores, I really wasn't ready to do the parts quite yet. And when I was, then it happened. And then the performance score was, a rental item, but not yet in print, which created this time for it to be refined through real world feedback. So what's the lesson here? Sometimes if you're not given what you want immediately, maybe there's a reason for that. And if you just accept that there's some sort of, the oversoul, the Emersonian oversoul is working on your behalf, and just relax and accept that, then you're going to find out over time that it's all for good and that there's going to be something wonderful at the end. The last example of this kind of delay resulting in something just exceeding my expectations of quality is this very video series. I had struggled for years trying to figure out how to record all this information about this, real world feedback project that I'd had that, needed to be saved as an oral history of sorts. And I tried writing the thing out and it just was going nowhere. And I'd, shelved the project and not really known what to do with it. And then out of the blue, Peter Brown, pianist in Wales, contacts me and says he's gotten the score to the Ives Fourth and is interested in it and wanted to ask some questions. And we did a Skype call, and there was far more that I could possibly tell him in one Skype call. And I said, I need to make videos of this or something. He said, oh, well, I've been making some videos. I have some experience doing that, and maybe I could help you out. And I'm like, are you sure? And the next thing I know, we're corresponding and we're making these videos, and he's doing with the raw footage that I'm sending him far more than I could ever have done. So once again, the fact that I hadn't been assembling an oral history from the beginning of the project, when I couldn't have known there would have been anything that would have worked as an oral history, it all worked out. It all has worked out. And I have a deep debt of gratitude to Peter Brown for making this entire video series possible. It wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for him reaching out to me and then offering his help. Thanks, Peter.